You've heard many loud statements about the oil price cap and other tough sanctions that hit the Kremlin. But if that's true, why does Russian oil still flow abroad and billions continue going to the Kremlin's treasury? And you've probably heard about the so-called shadow fleet, which is the main tool for circumventing these sanctions. As a result, hundreds of old battered tankers suddenly got a second life. There seem to be sanctions, but the result is strange. The Russian Federation continues to sell its oil through countries like India and China. And it turns out that the West itself has created a gray economy worth billions. That's what we'll talk about today. Semyon Mikoshu television channel. Let's begin. Where did the shadow fleet come from? Transporting oil while bypassing rules isn't a new idea. The first to work out this scheme was Iran. For decades under sanctions, it transported oil through front companies and old ships. Russia adopted this scheme. After 2022, when the usual routes were cut off by sanctions, Moscow simply scaled up the Iranian experience to avoid losing exports. They started buying up used tankers. Through chains of companies in the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Hong Kong, and other jurisdictions, they mainly bought ships that were 15 to 20 years old. Basically, those that were already lined up for scrap metal, cheap, fast, and without too many questions from the previous owners. That's how a new sector formed. The white fleet operates by the rules, with transparent owners and insurance, while the gray fleet hides its owners, sails under foreign flags, and often disappears from radar. By early 2023, Moscow had assembled over 100 such vessels. And the process didn't stop. Ship owners from countries that publicly condemned Russia themselves even joined the scheme. As a result, the sanctions that were supposed to block exports actually created a parallel logistics system for them. Less transparent, but effective enough for money to keep flowing into the Russian treasury. How does the sanctions evasion scheme work? How exactly does the sanctions evasion scheme operate? The most common trick is a meeting of tankers in neutral waters. One comes directly from a Russian port. The other is listed as clean. The vessels move close, connect hoses, and transfer oil between ships. On the surface, it appears to be a standard transfer, which is common when a large tanker can't access a shallow port. But the real goal is simply to hide the cargo's Russian origin. After such an operation, it's almost impossible to track that this raw material came from Ust-Luga or Novorossiysk. Another thing is that every vessel is required to turn on the automatic identification system beacon, which transmits its coordinates. This is a safety system so that ships don't collide and so that the authorities can see the routes. But the shadow fleet has learned to bypass this rule as well. Sometimes tankers simply turn off the automatic identification system and become invisible. A more advanced method is signal spoofing. The ship looks like it's in one spot on the map, but it's actually somewhere else. As a result, even international databases record false routes. I don't think I need to tell you that this is dangerous. And for regular shipping, every vessel must have the flag of the country under whose jurisdiction it operates. Private carriers are registered in highly regulated countries. But the shadow fleet prefers flags of convenience like Panama, Liberia, and Cameroon, where the requirements are minimal, inspections are rare, and changing registration can be done in a couple of weeks. As a result, the same tanker can operate under several different flags in a year, which covers its tracks and makes control more difficult. Oil, like any other cargo, can't be transported without insurance. If there's an accident or a spill, the responsibility falls on the insurance company. But what do you do when Western insurers refuse to work with Russian cargo? That's when little-known or paper companies from Russia, the Middle East, or Asia come into play. There is formal insurance, but if a disaster happens, there might not be any real compensation. This makes transportation both non-transparent and highly dangerous. So, what do we see as a result? Each of these tricks by itself looks like a minor cunning move, but together they turn into a very complicated scheme. Take a hypothetical tanker that's over 20 years old, for example. Previously, it sailed under the Greek flag, transporting oil across the Mediterranean. In 2022, it was bought by a little-known company in Dubai. The next day, the vessel is renamed and registered in Panama. A few months later, it switches its flag to Cameroon. On paper, it's like a new vessel, but in reality, the hull is still the same. When the ship heads to a Russian port, its automatic identification system works properly, but as soon as it enters international waters, the signal suddenly goes silent. A few days later, the tanker reappears in the system. Supposedly, it was anchored off the coast of Africa, but in reality, it was transferring oil ship to ship off the coast of Greece the whole time, using another vessel for cover. There is insurance, but not from well-known international clubs. It's from shell companies registered somewhere in the Middle East. Officially, the paperwork is in order, but in reality, if there's an accident, there will be no one to pay. As a result, this one single rusty tanker can change its name 3 times, its flag twice, and disappear from the map dozens of times in a year. And all this is done so that the oil arriving at the buyer's port supposedly has no Russian origin. Who buys the oil? Russia's main clients are China and India. After 2022, these two countries became the backbone of Russian exports. China increased its purchases by about a quarter, and India went from being a minor player to the largest buyer. If earlier Indian refineries hardly worked with Russian oil, now they take up to 2 million barrels a day. For Moscow, this is a lifeline. Europe closed its doors, but Asia opened them willingly. India refines some of the oil into fuel for its domestic market, but a significant portion goes back for export. It turns into a closed loop. Russian oil becomes Indian gasoline or diesel, and then this supposedly Indian product ends up in Europe. Formally, everything is clean. Europe doesn't buy Russian oil, but at gas stations, Europeans calmly fill up with fuel made from it. Noise. To make the deals look even less transparent, there are new layers between Moscow and the end buyers, traders and brokers, especially many of them in Dubai and Singapore. These are shell companies created specifically to trade oil under sanctions. On paper, the owners can be citizens of different countries, but the real beneficiaries can't be found. Today the company opens, tomorrow it changes its name or moves to another jurisdiction. Why does this work? For China and India, one thing matters: the price. Russian oil comes at a discount, and compared to expensive Middle Eastern grades, it's a good deal. For traders from Dubai or Singapore, it's just business. They don't care about the war in some distant Ukraine. Each trip brings in millions, and no politics outweighs that profit. In the end, it turned into a double game. Russia sells oil bypassing sanctions. China and India get cheap raw materials, and intermediaries make super profits. And Europe, which loudly declared its refusal of Russian fuel, in reality continues to use it, just under different labels. How does the West respond? Editor. You might say, well, if everyone knows, then how do Western countries react to all of Moscow's attempts to bypass restrictions? The main method is the introduction of the so-called price cap. The idea is nice, but the implementation still leaves much to be desired. The Europeans understand perfectly well that it's impossible to completely give up Russian oil, especially Hungary and Slovenia are vocal about this. This will increase prices in these countries. That's why the European Union and the G7 countries came up with a compromise in 2022, not to ban Russian oil completely, but to set a price cap of $60 per barrel. The idea was to keep the flow to the global market, but cut Moscow's revenues. On paper, the decision looked smart, but in practice, the scheme created a shadow market that operates by its own rules. London traditionally leads on sanction policy. In May 2025, the British government announced the largest package of restrictions. About 100 tankers connected to the shadow fleet fell under these restrictions. It's noteworthy that they did this on May 9th, a sacred day for the Russian Federation. Symbolically, it looked like a political slap in the face to the Kremlin, not just an economic measure. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia support a total ban on shadow tankers in European Union waters, citing ecology and anti-circumvention efforts. Sanctions, essentially, as another way to put pressure on Moscow. The Baltic Sea is turning into a potential conflict zone, where any detention of a vessel could escalate into a diplomatic crisis. Brussels is being more cautious. By the end of 2024, 52 vessels were added to the sanctions list, later rising to 79. But that's just a drop in the ocean. The Shadow Fleet has hundreds or thousands of tankers, so less than 10% are truly impacted by restrictions. Meanwhile, the United States Congress is considering seizing shadow oil tankers. In words, it sounds tough. But in reality, Washington is afraid that any sudden move could cause a rise in global oil and gasoline prices. And that would hit the American voter as well, which is much more sensitive for politicians than the schemes of Russian exporters. And lately, mysterious incidents have been happening more and more often with Russian tankers. One after another, there are reports of fires, spills, and accidents. There was a major fuel spill in the Kerch Strait, and in June 2025, the story of the tanker Villamura under the flag of the Marshall Islands made headlines. It carried 1 million barrels of oil, but a random explosion in the engine room left it dead in the water, and the vessel had to be towed to the border, a Greek port. Officially, it's called a technical malfunction. But when it comes to the Shadow Fleet, where the ships are old and the routes are shrouded in fog, it's hard to believe that such coincidences are always accidental. Some experts talk about the natural wear and tear of the fleet, while others hint at outside interference. The truth, as always, sinks somewhere between official reports and political interests. Scale and Money, subtitles by Dima Torzuk. Despite sanctions and the price cap, oil exports remain the main source of money for the Kremlin. Maritime exports alone earn Russia hundreds of millions of euros daily, excluding refined products like gasoline and diesel. This creates a flow that daily fuels Russia's war machine and economy. Sadly, it's not only the Kremlin profiting from this. Every step in the chain brings money to someone. Carriers, brokers in Dubai or Singapore, refineries in China or India. As a result, new billionaires are emerging in this shadow market. People and companies that nobody knew just a couple of years ago. The only losers are those who believe that sanctions can stop this oil and gas flow of money. The paradox is that the price cap aimed to cut Russia's revenues but actually created a gray economy. Deals are structured so that on paper the price hits the limit, while the real amounts are hidden in delivery markups and intermediary services. Thus, the oil sells at a higher price, making the profit even greater than with honest deliveries. What danger does the Shadow Fleet pose? I've already mentioned that the Shadow Fleet mainly consists of old tankers that frankly belong in the scrapyard. They have worn-out hulls, faulty safety systems, and overdue inspections. If a ship like that springs a leak or collides with another vessel, the consequences will be catastrophic. Oil spills could cover entire coastlines, destroying fishing and tourism. The most dangerous part is no one will pay for the damage. After 2022, the Baltic Sea became the route for many gray shipments. It's crowded here, the waters are limited, and every extra tanker increases the risk of incidents. This forces the Baltic countries to take radical actions. One of the recent examples is the detention of the tanker Kivala, part of Russia's Shadow Fleet, by the Estonian Defense Forces. Moscow is responding by similarly detaining Western vessels. It turns into a dangerous game where, interestingly, any clash can turn into an international scandal. There are examples when shadow logistics became not only an economic factor but also a military one. One of the Russian tankers was suspected of damaging the underwater cable connecting Finland and Estonia. If this is confirmed, it turns out that ships from the Shadow Fleet can be used as an element of hybrid warfare, not only to transport oil, but also to damage the infrastructure of neighboring countries. The detention of tankers, attempts at inspection in neutral waters, and mutual accusations of maritime piracy are already a reality. Legal uncertainty is turning the sea into a field for provocations. The longer the Shadow Fleet operates, the higher the chance that one incident will escalate into a serious military confrontation. So what do we end up with? In 3 years, the Shadow Fleet has become a full parallel system in global oil trade. Russia, unfortunately, still continues to receive billions, even if not as much as before. China and India are getting cheap raw materials. The latter didn't care at all about Trump's sanctions. Petrodollars are more important. And in general, a separate caste of oil intermediaries is emerging. there's a price to bypassing sanctions. This includes accidents, environmental disasters, and rising tensions in the Baltic. Moreover, the tankers themselves are starting to be used as a tool of hybrid warfare, from putting pressure on neighbors to suspicions of sabotage. And finally, the main question is whether the European Union, Britain, and the United States are ready to take truly tough measures at the expense of their own consumers, a rhetorical question. This measure doesn't really threaten the United States, but for Europe, it's certainly an interesting question. So, write your opinion in the comments. I'd be interested to read it. Well, goodbye everyone.